Hello, this is Candy with eyes2jesus.blogspot.com, and welcome as we continue on our study and our fantastic journey through the book of Isaiah. Isaiah is a pretty exciting book, at least I think so. I find it rather fascinating. Every time I read through the book of Isaiah, I'm always wowed. So here we are, we're up to Isaiah chapter 10. If you would like to follow along in the same Bible translation I'm using the Young's Literal Translation. So let's jump right in, chapter 10, beginning with verse 1. Woe to those decreeing decrees of iniquity and writers who have prescribed perverseness, to turn aside from judgment the poor, and to take violently away the judgment of the afflicted of my people, that widows may be their prey, that the fatherless they may spoil. So two things here, okay? One, this is talking about basically the lawmakers and those in power who aren't actually taking care of their constituents. They are actually doing things for selfish means, for power means, for themselves, and not actually to help their constituents. So woe to them. Now, this is specifically referring to the lawmakers of the house of Israel and what they were doing at that time, but it's also woe to any lawmakers that do that to anyone. Corrupt politicians of today, not accepted. So them too. Okay, continuing with verse 3. And what do ye at a day of inspection, and at desolation? From afar it cometh. Near whom do ye flee for help? And where do ye leave your honor? So now the Lord's saying to these corrupted politicians of today and of back then of the house of Israel, he's saying, so you have no honor, so where do you get your honor from? You don't have any honor. The day of inspection or the day of judgment, who are you going to go to for help? You can't justify your evil. There is no justification for evil. When the day of judgment comes upon them, unless they had repented and turned back to the Lord, that's it for them. Okay, so corrupted politicians are going to get their comeuppance. Verse 4. Without me, this is the Lord speaking, without me it hath bowed down in the place of a bound one, and in the place of the slain they fall. With all this not turned back hath hissed God's anger, and still his hand is stretched out. So the Lord is saying, without me, house of Israel, you would have fallen long ago. But the Lord's hand of protection was always somewhat over the house of Israel. But he's saying, not anymore. Now it is time for judgment. Payday, the day of recompense has come. To now it's like, well, the Lord kept sending prophets to the house of Israel saying, repent, return back to me, repent, return back to me. And they continued to just become more and more vile and corrupt instead of returning to the one true God. So now it is time to pay the piper. All right, now again, we have that phrase we've been seeing repeated, with all this not turned back hath his anger. So the Lord's anger of judgment is still happening upon the house of Israel, and now it's coming up to the point to where they're going to go into the Assyrian captivity. This will be the fall of the house of Israel. And we have that phrase, and still his hand is stretched out. So his hand is stretched out, still getting judgment on them, but his hand is also stretched out for please come back to me and repent. Verse 5. Woe to Ashur, a rod of mine anger, and a staff in their hand is mine indignation. Ashur is the Assyrians. So some Bible translations say Ashur, some Bible translations say Assyrians. They are the same people. So he's saying that that Ashur or the Assyrians is a rod of God's anger. In other words, God is using the Assyrians as like his spanking rod to spank Israel, his naughty child. So Ashur or Assyria is being used as a tool from God to bring judgment upon the house of Israel. Verse 6, Against a profane nation I send him, and conquering a people of my wrath I charge him, to spoil spoil, and to seize prey, and to make it a treading place as the clay of out places. So the profane nation that God is sending Ashur to is that he is allowing the Assyrians or Ashur to overtake the house of Israel, leading to the fall of the house of Israel and into the Assyrian captivity of the house of Israel. All right, then concerning a people of my wrath, I charge him. So he is unleashing his wrath upon the house of Israel via Ashur or the Assyrians. Now, does this phrase sound familiar if you've been following along in this Isaiah study with me? To spoil, spoil, and to seize prey. This should recall us back to our chapter 8 study. What was the name that God told Israel to name his second-born son? Maher-Shalal-Hashbaz, one of the longest names in the Bible. And what does Maher-Shalal-Hashbaz mean? Well, let's turn back to chapter 8 really quick. And it says here, right there, it says, to haste spoil, enjoy prey. So Maher-Shalal-Hashbaz means to haste, spoil, enjoy, prey. And he was named that prophetically, as well as his name being written on a clay tablet with specific witnesses, because it was a prophecy of the fall of the house of Israel. That prophecy now here in chapter 10 has come to pass. Maher-Shalal-Hashbaz, coming to pass. What we see here in verse 6, to spoil, spoil, and to seize, prey. Continuing on with verse 7, and he thinketh not so, and his heart reckoneth not so, for to destroy is in his heart, and to cut off nations not a few. So God called Ashur to bring his judgment upon the house of Israel. But the king of Ashur is like, nah, this is all my power. This is all my doing. The Israel God has nothing to do with any of this. This is all me because I'm all amazing, basically. Okay, verse 8. For he saith, are not my princes altogether kings? Is not Calno as Carchemish? Is not Hamath as Arpad? Is not Samaria as Damascus? So the king of Ashur is basically saying, look how powerful I am. Look at all these kingdoms that I took down. For example, in the example of is not Samaria as Damascus. Damascus being the major city of Syria or Aram. And how Assyria or Ashur also took them down and took Damascus. And he's saying, just like I took Damascus, I take Samaria. It's my doing. Look at this power that I have. So that's what the king of Ashur is thinking here in his heart. Even though it's established, no, he's a rod in the hand of God to bring judgment. Okay? And then also just where it says, is not Calno as Carchemish. Does Carchemish sound familiar? Carchemish in the Hebrew, it means basically the house of Chemosh. Chemosh is one of the names for the fake male deity that the Israelites hoard after and the other peoples of the lands hoard after. Chemosh is Moloch and Baal. Chemosh is the deity, the false god, that was born on December 25th, of which originated the pagan festivity that these days is called Christmas. Okay? So now, verse 10, as my hand hath got to the kingdoms of a worthless thing, and their graven images greater than Jerusalem and than Samaria, do I not, as I have done to Samaria and to her worthless things, so do to Jerusalem and to her grievous things? Okay, so two things here. One, if this is still the king of Assyria or Ashur speaking, then he would be saying, okay, just like I took down the house of Israel, I now set my sights to take down the house of Jerusalem. However, I question that if this is the Assyrian king speaking. I think this returned to God speaking. Because verse 10, as my hand hath got to the kingdoms of a worthless thing, and their graven images greater than Jerusalem and then Samaria. So I don't think that this was still the king of Ashur speaking. I think this is returning to God speaking, and how God used the king of Ashur or Assyria as his rod of judgment, and how he didn't just use Assyria or Ashur as his rod of judgment against the house of Israel, but also against kingdoms that were even greater than Jerusalem and Samaria, who had their graven images. All right, now continuing on verse 12, and it hath come to pass, when the Lord doth fulfill all his work in Mount Zion and in Jerusalem, I see concerning the fruit of the goodness of the heart of the king of Ashur, and concerning the glory of the height of his eyes. So the Lord is still doing a work at this point in the house of Jerusalem, the house of Judah. So while the house of Israel, they kept getting their chances and they kept turning down their chances, so they finally fell into judgment via the Assyrian captivity, basically saying, but the Lord isn't done yet with the house of Judah, so they are not going to go the way of Israel and also fall into Assyrian captivity, because he still has a work that he is doing in Mount Zion and in Jerusalem. But what about the fruit of the greatness of the heart of King Ashur? What is in his heart? This is what we're going to see starting in verse 13. For he hath said, by the power of my hand I have wrought, and by my wisdom, for I have been intelligent, and I removed the borders of the people, and their chief ones I have spoiled, and I put down as a mighty one the inhabitants, and my hand as to a nest getteth to the wealth of the peoples, and as a gathering of forsaken eggs, all the earth have I gathered, and there hath not been one moving wing or one opening mouth or whispering. So the king of Ashur is full of pride, showing that his heart is full of pride. That's the fruit of his heart. So who does this remind you of? It reminds me of King Nebuchadnezzar, that we read about his pride and his fall in the book of Daniel. And we did a study going through the whole book of Daniel. So if that's something that interests you, you can take a look at my Daniel playlist on my YouTube channel of Eyes to Jesus. Okay, now resuming the verse 15. Doth the axe glorify itself against him who is hewing with it? Doth the saw magnify itself against him who is shaking it? As a rod waving those lifting it up, as a staff lifting up that which is not wood? So basically, in response to the king of Ashur or Assyria saying, I did all this mighty stuff, basically we're being told here, no. It's like he was an axe in the hand of a man cutting down a tree. If you are cutting down a tree with an axe, who cut down the tree? Did you cut down the tree with the axe as your tool, or did the axe cut down the tree and you don't even count? See, it really brings into clarity the logic of the whole gun argument. Do guns kill people, or do people kill people? Clearly, people kill people. Just as if you have an axe in your hand and you're chopping down the tree, you're the one who chopped down the tree. The axe would not have jumped up and ran over and chopped down the tree itself if it wasn't at your hand. So that's what that's talking about. So just like people kill people, guns is just the tool being used. If you chop down a tree, you are the one chopping down the tree. The axe is just a tool that you use. So also we're being told here that the king of Ashur thinks he is all this great mighty thing, but he's the axe, boasting to the one holding the axe, okay? He is the rod that was used to bring judgment, but the one wielding the rod or wielding the axe against these trees is God. And remember, throughout Isaiah and throughout the Bible, in both Old and New Testament, people are symbolized as trees. And we've gone over this in our previous chapters in our Isaiah studies. Okay, so verse 16. Therefore doth the Lord of hosts, send among his fat ones leanness, and under his honor he kindleth a burning as the burning of a fire. And the light of Israel hath been for a fire, and his Holy One for a flame. And it hath burned and devoured his thorn and his briar in one day. So remember, trees symbolize people, and he's talking about when he used the rod of his wrath, being Ashur, to take down the house of Israel. It's like a burning down and a chopping down of the forest. The house of Israel being the forest, the trees being the people of the house of Israel. Verse 18, and the honor of his forest and his fruitful field, from soul even unto flesh, he doth consume, and it hath been as a fainting of a standard bearer. Okay, so did every tree of the house of Israel get burned, destroyed, or cut down? No, but most of them did. Look at verse 19. And the rest of the trees of his forest are few, and a youth doth write them. So there's still some trees standing in the house of Israel forest at this point, but not very many. Verse 20. And it hath come to pass in that day, the remnant of Israel, and the escaped of the house of Jacob, do not add any more to lean on its smiter, and have leaned on Jehovah, the Holy One of Israel, in truth. So remember, and still his hand is stretched out, and still his hand is stretched out. We kept reading. What did that mean? One, his hand was stretched out, bringing judgment to them, but also two, his hand was stretched out to take the hand of any of those who wanted to turn and return back to God, those who wanted to repent. So those who did repent, their trees did not get chopped down in the forest. The judgment that came upon Israel, they had a measure of protection against that judgment. Does it mean that they weren't at all affected? No, it does not at all, because that's the whole point of evil. It is a leaven. It leavens a whole lump. Everybody can be affected by someone else's evil or someone else's sin. But they had a measure of protection. Just like in the 7-year tribulation, the people of God will have a measure of God's protection for the first 3.5 years of the tribulation. And then they will be raptured at the middle tribulation, 7th trumpet rapture, 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 50 through 52, Revelation chapter 11, verses 15 through 18. So until that time happens, there is a measure of protection. So the remnant are those who returned back to the one true God. So their trees are still standing. They had a measure of protection. They weren't completely unaffected by judgment, because that's not the nature of sin and evil in this fallen world, but God put his hand over them, you could say. He gave them a measure of protection. Verse 22, for though thy people Israel be as the sand of the sea, a remnant doth return of it, a consumption determined, overflowing with righteousness. So in other words, there was so many Israelites of the house of Israel that counting them would be like counting how many grains of sand there were on the beach. It would be quite a monumental task. Out of all of them, that forest was all cut down and destroyed, except for the remnant, the few that remained true or turned back to the one true God. And that remnant is like a handful. They are easily countable. Verse 23, for a consumption that is determined, the Lord Jehovah of hosts is making in the midst of all the land. Therefore, thus saith the Lord Jehovah of hosts, be not afraid, my people inhabiting Zion, because of Ashur, with a rod he doth smite thee, and his staff lifteth up against thee in the way of Egypt. So in other words, now we're shifting over to, okay, well, what's going on at the house of Judah? Okay, and we know that because it's talking about Zion, okay, inhabiting Zion, or inhabiting Jerusalem, the house of Judah. So in other words, he's saying just like there was a remnant in the house of Israel, there are still people of God in the house of Judah. And there's still enough people of God at this point in the house of Judah that they aren't going to receive their full judgment yet. So he's saying, you know, you saw Ashur taking down the house of Israel. Just letting you know, house of Judah, you've still got more time. You've still got more people in you for me than Israel had at that time. So you still have time to repent. So I'm telling you, Ashur is not going to take you down. In fact, Ashur, or Assyria, falls a little while after it took down the house of Israel. It eventually falls to the Babylonians. Verse 25, for yet a very little, and the indignation hath been completed, and mine anger by their wearing out. And awaking for him is Jehovah of hosts, a scourge like the smiting of Midian at the rock of Oreb, and his rod is over the sea, and he hath lifted it in the way of Egypt. So he's saying, okay, you know, Ashur or Assyria, they're going to fall too. Okay, and it's going to be like their scourge or their fall. It's going to be like the smiting of Midian at the rock of Oreb. And again, that's referring to Midian and Gideon. I think it's in Judges chapter 8. So it's saying their fall, the fall of Ashur, is going to be like the fall of Midian at the time of Midian and Gideon. Verse 27, and it hath come to pass in that day, in the day of the fall of Ashur, turned is his burden from off thy shoulder, and his yoke from off thy neck, and destroyed hath been the yoke because of prosperity. So even though Ashur tries and tries and tries to get the house of Judah, and he puts them under oppression, there will be in that day when Ashur starts reaching its time of destruction, its time of judgment, that Ashur will have to completely leave the house of Judah alone, that they won't have any power over the house of Judah anymore. Verse 28, he hath come in against Aiath, he hath passed over into Migron, at Michmash he looketh after his vessels, they have gone over the passage. Geba they have made a lodging place, trembled hath Ramah, Gibeah of Saul fled. Cry aloud with thy voice, daughter of Gallim, give attention, Laeth, answer her, Anathoth, Fled away hath Madmenah, the inhabitants of the high places have hardened themselves. Yet today in Nob to remain, wave its hand doth the mount of the daughter of Zion, the hill of Jerusalem. So we just have a very abbreviated history of some of the conquerings that Ashur conquered, these various different lands that they conquered and overtook, and of course they also then overtook the house of Israel. But what is it saying here? Wave its hand at the mount of the daughter of Zion, the hill of Jerusalem. So the house of Israel or the house of Judah can just wave Ashur away, because Ashur will not take them like they took the house of Israel. Ashur falls. Verse 33, Lo, the Lord Jehovah of hosts is lopping a branch with violence, and the high of stature are cut down, and the lofty are become low. And he hath gone round the thickets of the forest with iron, and Lebanon by a mighty one falleth. Okay, so lopping a branch with violence, and the high stature are cut down. In other words, one, the forest of trees, the trees symbolizing the individuals of the house of Israel, were burned down or cut down, except for the remnant that turned back to or stayed with the one true Lord. They had a measure of God's protection. Two, he is also now cutting down the trees, cutting them down to size of Ashur, or the Assyrians. The Assyrians got cut down to size. So that's kind of where we can maybe see how that saying originated. They were big, mighty trees, but they were cut down to size. Okay, now in verse 34, notice here it's mentioning Lebanon here. And he hath gone around the thickets of the forest with iron, and Lebanon by a mighty one falleth. Often powerful ones, such as the king of Assyria, in the Bible is referred to as a cedar of Lebanon. So that's one of the reasons why Lebanon is mentioned here, but this has a double meaning. Okay, so verse 34 is recalling us back to chapter 9, verses 1 and 2, which says, As the former time made light the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali, so the latter hath honored the way of the sea beyond the Jordan, Galilee of the nations. The people who are walking in darkness have seen a great light. Dwellers in a land of death shade, light hath shone upon them. In our study of Isaiah chapter 9, especially when we went over those two verses, we looked at some maps, and we saw that, wow, that gave us the physical location of the valley of death shade, also known as the valley of the shadow of death, which is famous in Psalm chapter 23, verse 4. So it is also saying that these people were, and the valley of the shadow of death is in Lebanon. So let's put that out there. So it's basically saying that these people of Ashur, they walked in the darkness. They walked in the demonic deeds of that valley of death shade mentioned in chapter 9, verses 1 and 2. And they too are cut down. And that concludes our study of Isaiah chapter 10. Have a blessed day.